Hilary, I want to look at one of the other reforms that was announced by the White House, and that is poor defendants who cannot afford bail can't be jailed anymore. You know, we've seen and read about the horrendous cases that have been taking place at Rikers Island in New York, that tragic story of a young boy who was incarcerated for 3 years, awaiting trial, 2 of them in solitary confinement. He was released. He subsequently committed suicide. Why is that not a major issue in this country?
Well, I think it is for many of us as we think about the poorest of the poor. For those who have the resources they can put down to hold the places as they go out and come back and actually stand trial and whatnot is one thing. If you look at most of those who are actually in our prisons today, it's a good indication of who ends up finding themselves on bail as well. And that is, we know that in our prisons, less than half of those are there for nonviolent, mostly drug-related offenses. Not people that are going to actually hurt anyone else, not folks that are a threat to the local communities and otherwise, but those that have made the mistake of utilizing drugs, perhaps being addicted to drugs and other issues along those lines. So if we think about people actually having to spend time in jail simply because their pocketbooks won't allow them to go free, it raises major concerns. We were delighted to see some of the things that have happened in places like New Jersey and a few other places across the country, and we're hoping to see more bail reform as we move throughout.
Christopher?
Yeah, I think that's right. It also strikes me as important to think about the ways in which class and socioeconomic status serve as sorting mechanisms for those who find themselves caught in sort of the nettle of the criminal justice system. Loic Wacant, who's a researcher at UC Berkeley, published a piece in 2009, 2010, finding that around that time, I believe it was during 2009, out of everyone who went to prison that year, at the time of their arrest, 50%, a full 50%, were living at or below half of the federal poverty line, which is around $6,500 a year. It's important to remember the way in which that serves as a mechanism for sorting.
Arjun, there was a report issued in... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump in on the tail end of Chris's comments. You know, in prison legal news, we published on this previously, which is there's really a dual system of justice in the United States. There's one for the wealthy and the connected and people who have means and power, and then there's one for everybody else. And the way we like to put it is you get as much justice as you can afford.
That's right.
And bail is the epitome of that, because if you have money, you can make bail and you will not be in jail. But if you are poor, you cannot make bail, you stay in jail. And it's as simple and as clear-cut as that. And that is only one small illustration of how our justice system works when it comes to wealth and socioeconomic status and power. So yes, bail reform is most definitely necessary and will significantly unclog a lot of our backed-up court system and overcrowded jail systems if people don't have to spend time in jail while they're awaiting trial and presumed innocent simply because they're poor.
Arjun, you're the attorney here. You know, what Alex is talking about, the way people are treated differently, this twin-track system of justice that we have, is that not a violation of the U.S. Constitution?
Look, there's no question to revisit this issue on class. People who are poor are more acutely impacted by mass incarceration. So are people who are of minority descent, in particular African Americans. African Americans are more likely to be stopped, arrested, prosecuted, and receive lengthier sentences. That does raise interesting constitutional questions, specifically due process at each step of the stage. So for example, when you look at something like stop and frisk in New York, we saw that African Americans were being acutely impacted by this policy that was supposedly facially neutral, and a judge found that the policy disproportionately impacted African Americans and violated the reasonable suspicion standard of the Constitution. So we are making incremental progress on some of these issues, but not enough. Even if you look at something like right to counsel, the right to counsel is supposed to be applicable to everyone, but we've always found that African Americans and poor criminal defendants are unable often to afford counsel. And as a consequence, they're more likely to plead guilty, not get bail, and languish in our prisons.
All right, and what about violation of human rights? There was a Human Rights Watch report, which was produced in 2014, which expressed concerns about human rights in the United States. So how does human rights fit in with the criminal justice system?
Thank you for raising that. It's my belief that the U.S. criminal justice system is a human rights catastrophe. every step of the stage in terms of people being stopped, people being prosecuted, the length of the sentences, things like solitary confinement. So we've just found that really every facet of the criminal justice system implicates different human rights norms, including the prohibition against solitary confinement, including guarantees of due process, fair trial, equal protection, measures like that.
Well, let's add the utilization of the death penalty to that matter as well.
Absolutely.
We're still a country that executes both at the state level as well as at the federal level.
Christopher, Arjun made that point earlier on that the United States has the highest prison population in the world, most of them being people of color. A lot of people ended up in prison over the last 20 or 30 years because of the so-called war on drugs. So a lot of, especially young black people, ended up in prison. And there are some people, like the movie maker Michael Moore, who says that this was actually a very devious way of disenfranchising black people, that, you know, their vote was taken away because they now have a felony conviction, so they lost the vote, and in many instances that changed the political picture in many, many states. Does he have a point there?
He does have a point. I think from a theoretical perspective, policies, just because policies perhaps are unintentional, it doesn't mean they're accidental. Right. I think that's an important point to underscore, right? And whereas I would argue that certainly laws that are architected, as Arjun said, as sort of facially race neutral, certainly have a disparate impact on communities of color in every stage of the criminal processing system, whether that's life conditions, whether that's surveillance and policing, whether that is interrogation. There are a whole host of studies that now suggest that one's race, at least in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, was a major factor in whether or not pretrial interrogations were taped. What does that say about the equal application of justice?
Well, if I can even add, if we look at the utilization of things like disenfranchisement of felony offenders, it certainly states that first began using that were states that were trying to disenfranchise African Americans very specifically. There were states like Mississippi at the time that had an African American population that was 45% during those years. Yet African Americans could not get elected into statewide or federal positions coming to Congress or the like. They utilized tools like our criminal justice system and even crafted the kind of offenses that you would very well be brought up on and to have your right to vote taken away from you altogether and never returned. Even if we look at how that works today, we have about 6 million Americans that cannot vote because they have felony offenses on their record. If you look at the kind of offenses they are, what you'll see again is that there's that disparate impact as it affects African Americans, Latinos, and other people of color in the country. So it raises major concerns, not only in incarceration, but also the effect of being prosecuted and found guilty of a crime, even as you try to come back out and become a constructive, contributing member of society.
You know, Hilary, there's a great quote from Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, in which she says, like Jim Crow and slavery, mass incarceration operates as a tightly networked system of laws, policies, customs, and institutions that operate collectively to ensure the subordinate status of a group defined largely by race.
Absolutely true. As a matter of fact, it's amazing that she was able to take so many decades of experiences in the criminal justice system and make it very clear for today. There's no question about those issues, or even how, even as people are being incarcerated, forms of slavery are actually utilized in prisons in which corporations are able to go in, contract with the prison, get their work done very, very cheaply. And those prisons are getting very little to nothing. They come out with very little to nothing and find themselves in that spiral of going back again. So the point she's making is absolutely right on target. If we think about disenfranchisement and other forms of capital, whether it's political capital or economic capital, all those things come into play.
Alex, when it comes to serving time in prison, you know, as Hilary pointed out earlier on, it's supposedly about rehabilitation, about training people who go to prison so that they can come out and contribute usefully to society. Was that your experience, or is it just about punishment?
Oh, that's simply a myth that hasn't existed since the 1970s at best. So prison has nothing to do with rehabilitation. If we wanted to design a system to basically ensure that people who go to prison come out and are more likely to commit crimes, then that is the system that we have. We've done a great job at it. So when people are incarcerated, they're stripped of all responsibility. They're completely controlled. They're often humiliated, subjected to abuse in many different ways. Their underlying issues that led to their incarceration, which typically are alcohol or drug abuse or mental health issues, since our prisons and jails are de facto mental health facilities in this country, those issues do not get addressed while they're incarcerated. Then they are released with a felony record that makes it almost impossible for them to find a job that provides a living wage. And with a felony record also makes it difficult for them to find a stable residence and place to stay. They receive virtually no rehabilitative services while they're incarcerated, and for some reason we are astounded that we have a recidivism rate up to 67% or so. Frankly, I'm surprised it's not enormously higher, given that we have designed a system that is instructional in terms of ensuring that people fail once they get out of prison.
20 seconds I have. What is President Obama's, what legacy does he leave on reforming criminal justice?
I think President Obama has touched the tip of the iceberg here in a powerfully material and symbolic way. I think the rate of clemency that he's granted recently is something that's been just unprecedented.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.